Iain McLean, the floor is yours.
Good evening, colleagues. Ha'akambek and Gaelig, but I will speak in English. I'm very grateful to ECPR for this invitation. Here we are in Glasgow. There's an event happening in 2 weeks' time, which you've heard about. And I'm very grateful to the very high-class warm-up I had from Cabinet Secretary Mike Russell. So it would be very tempting to talk about Scotland. However, Maurizio and the organisers are very keen for me not to be parochial in this talk. So I take my cue from somebody who's been mentioned twice already this evening, who delivered the most important series of political science lectures ever given, namely Adam Smith, Professor of Moral Philosophy at this university, not in this building. And Smith was a Scotsman. He spoke about the world. I will try to follow inadequately in his footsteps. So here is my title. And here is a summary of what I want to cover if time permits. I will expound the two key concepts in fiscal federalism: vertical fiscal imbalance, VFI, and horizontal fiscal equalization, HFE. A consequence of VFI, where taxing is done in one place and spending in another, is that government in aggregate is tempted to spend more than it taxes. An obvious moral hazard is created. I then introduce an important concept suggested by the economist Charles Thibault in 1956. I aim to show that it is a valid principle, although it has been much derided. Whether it helps in practice may be a contingent matter of political culture. In my final section, I will look at five possible solutions to this problem of moral hazard, which I have listed on this slide, together with some countries where each of them might be held to apply, and I will come back to each of these countries as I go through. Now, a lecture like this cannot be data heavy, and as I was testing this out this afternoon, when I got back to about the 8th row, I found I could no longer see the numbers. I'm very sorry to those who cannot see the numbers. My slides will be freely available from me, or I hope possibly from the ECPR, if anybody wants to interrogate them. So whether or not you can see the numbers, let me explain the table, and then I will highlight some cases. The table shows OECD member states. My principle for compiling it is that I took every OECD member state that is at least as big as Scotland, except Greece. The reason for excluding Greece is that Greek numbers are not reliable. So that contains every OECD member state of the size of Scotland or larger, arranged in descending order of VFI, vertical fiscal imbalance, which I calculate for this purpose quite crudely as, and it's the right-hand column, the proportion of public spending by subnational government minus the proportion of tax raised by subnational government. So this runs from 21.3% in Denmark down to 2.4% in Germany. Note that the index is positive for every country in the table. In other words, in every OECD country for which I have data, the localities spend more than they raise. I highlight some countries of particular interest in red. Switzerland is, as you would expect, marked by high fiscal federalism and low VFI. We know about Switzerland. But you don't have to be a federal country to have low VFI. Look towards the bottom of the table at Czech Republic and Slovakia. By splitting in 1993, they broke up a federation and almost certainly lowered VFI in both countries, because transfers from the then richer part, now the Czech Republic, to the then poorer part, now Slovakia, ceased. This could be relevant to the country we are in. So I repeat that I can make the table freely available for those who would like to check the numbers. If you think that the numbers in the right-hand column are not big enough to worry about, so the highest number is 21.3%, remember that these are percentage of GDP, not percentages of public spending. In a median OECD country, public spending may be 40% of GDP. It goes up as high as 60, down as low as 20. If public spending is 40% of GDP, then you have to multiply these numbers by about 2.5 to get the proportion of public spending which is subject to VFI. So the table shows that VFI exists everywhere. Notice whether or not formally a federation. As I've just said, these numbers are percentages of GDP, not of public spending. Therefore, to get percentages of tax revenue, you have to multiply by about 2.5. VFI has a harmless stroke inevitable side and a potentially harmful side. Let's talk about the harmless or even desirable consequences first. To repeat, VFI occurs when one level of government raises most of the tax and another level does most of the spending. Usually, national government does most of the taxing and local or provincial government does more spending than taxing. Is this necessarily bad? One might say that the central government is usually the most efficient tax collector. Things or people can move. Some can move more easily than others. People can move from one area to another. Rich people may have more than one house and can claim to live in whichever leads to them paying less tax. Factories cannot move easily, but companies can move their head offices very quickly if there are tax advantages in doing so. Online activities can move instantaneously. Of course, they can move between countries, a factor that may depress the maximum that the state can take in tax. But they can also move within countries. That's why it may be most efficient to collect taxes on personal and company income, in the UK, those being income tax, national insurance contributions, and corporation tax, at national level, wherever the money is spent. The taxes that are best collected locally are taxes on stuff that doesn't move, such as land and unextracted oil. To go parochial for a minute, the Scottish Government already controls 3 bad land taxes: council tax, business rates, and stamp duty land tax. I could say in another lecture why they are all bad taxes. I can deal in questions, but for now I simply assert that they are all bad taxes. It did recently take a tentative step, and I was rather hoping the minister would still be here, but I hope at the back of the room a chiels among us taking notes. It took a tentative step by proposing a land and buildings transaction tax. Whether or not Scotland becomes independent, it could show the way by developing a land tax that is simultaneously more progressive, fairer, and more efficient than the present portfolio. A win all round, except, of course, for those who would have to pay a fairer share. Expenditure taxes, such as value-added tax and excise taxes on fuel and cigarettes and alcohol. Many of the countries in the table where local revenues are relatively high are large or thinly populated. People in these countries may be unwilling to move a long way in order to pay a little less tax, so it is relatively easier in a large or thinly populated country to allow expenditure tax rates to vary across the country. Not everyone would drive across a provincial boundary just to pay a few cents less on their purchases. In Canada, which I've had a look at, only one conurbation is on a provincial boundary, which is Ottawa, although quite a lot, in fact, all of the Canadian cities are near to the US border, which also restricts their power to tax. By contrast, if Scotland becomes independent or gains control over VAT or excise taxes, petrol, cigarettes, alcohol, then a huge retail shed will spring up alongside the A74 at either Gretna, if Scottish tax rates are lower, or Carlisle, if English rates are lower. If the relative rates fluctuate, there will be two hypermarkets, but at any one time, one of them will be derelict. And if you think this is fantasy, look at the French-Swiss border and look at the petrol stations on the Swiss side. This effect may be mitigated by the thinly populated Anglo-Scottish border, but some people do jump in their cars to travel 100 miles to save a few pence on petrol or alcohol. Now, continuing with the harmless aspects of VFI, it partly reflects horizontal fiscal equalization. HFE is perfectly normal, indeed desirable feature of taxing and spending in every democracy. Rich people tend to cluster in certain areas, and poor people in others. These clusters can be self-reinforcing. Rich people tend to cluster along with other rich people, perhaps because they're good at supplying services for one another, or because the places where they live are good at providing Porsche dealerships or Michelin-starred restaurants. This very trend creates its complement. Rich people living in places where most people are poor will want to move out. Poor people have to live somewhere. The places where other poor people live will have more affordable housing than you can get over a Porsche dealership or a Michelin restaurant. Almost all modern democracies have got some concept of a social union. In the UK, this is borne out by near total support for the concept of the NHS, National Health Service, as universal service open to all, free at the point of access, and on approximately the same terms for all. This sentiment is shared in some federal countries, such as Canada. In some countries, they also tend to say that welfare benefits, such as state pensions or unemployment benefits, should be paid at uniform rates throughout the country. Brits and Australians do, Canadians don't. So the second harmless component of VFI is part of equalization that comes automatically, since rich people pay more tax per head, at least in a progressive tax system, as advocated by Adam Smith, and poor people receive more benefits per head, at least where the benefits regime has not been captured by middle-class interests, as Adam Smith warned about. There is an automatic transfer from the parts of the country where richer people live to the parts where poor people live. When this happens automatically, it is nothing to worry about. But now we are getting to the heart of the problem, the perverse relationship between what the Canadians call tiers or orders of government that is set up almost everywhere. The higher tier finds it easier to raise taxes. The lower tier, which is closer to the people, often runs some of the expensive services, such as health or education. The overarching moral hazard is that the pleasure of spending is divorced from the pain of taxing. Politicians enjoy spending, they don't enjoy taxing. Being human, they spend too much and tax too little. Of course, there are hard budget constraints, but they do not bind on all politicians. They are more likely to bind on the top tier than on the lower. This sets up a number of perverse sub-games, which I'm looking at this slide. Money is typically transferred from central to local by two mechanisms. One is the automatic transfer that I mentioned. Tax rates are set at a uniform level for some taxes. Benefits are at a uniform level for some benefits. Money flows to the claimant. But in almost all regimes, there is also a block grant transfer from the centre to the local. And this is where VFI begins to get difficult. Block grants are distributed, people will say, on principles of need. But need turns out to be a remarkably flexible concept. Every subnational politician is incentivized to say that what his constituents lack is a need, and what other people's constituents lack is a policy choice. I'll give an example. Scotland has had two state education systems since 1918. It has a general state education system and it has a Catholic state education system because in 1918 it took over the Catholic schools lock, stock and barrel. If I was in Cabinet Secretary in Russell's place, and we were still in the UK, I would say Scotland needs to have 2 state education systems, even if that costs a bit more. If I'm in the UK Treasury's shoes, and we're still in the UK, I say Scotland has made a policy choice to have 2 state education systems. If that's what Scotland wants, Scotland has to be prepared to pay for it. And then there would be an argument about whether having 2 separate education systems is a need or a policy choice. I think this, I've given a Scottish example because I know about it, but this happens everywhere. Within the UK, it's been shown that the English, Scottish, and Welsh needs formulae, which in each country distribute grant from the centre to localities, local authorities, are so strikingly different that if you apply either the Scottish formula to England or the English formula to Scotland, you get completely different results for each local authority than if you apply each country's formula to its own local authorities. This suggests to me very powerfully that need is bargained between the politicians in the country in question, and that needs is what was once called an essentially contested concept. From the granting perspective, there are perverse incentives too. A naive central government favours the districts where its supporters live. A more sophisticated one favours those which it just marginally holds, or which it might gain at the next election. These patterns have been demonstrated cross-nationally. As you might expect, they are more prominent in plurality than in proportional regimes. The distribution of pork, I would say, is horizontal in plurality regimes and vertical in PR regimes. Even if pork is not an issue, the centre has an interest in imposing financial discipline, and the locality has an interest in evading it. The more prescriptive the centre is, the less point there is in having a local spending authority at all. The less prescriptive it is, the greater the resulting financial indiscipline is likely to be. So, how about a fresh start? This is to take the Tibu principle seriously. The Tibu principle is much misunderstood. Political scientists tend to treat it, when they have heard of it, more scornfully than economists, and I think they're wrong. Tibu principle may be stated as I have here: everybody moves to the jurisdiction with their optimal bundle of taxes and services. You vote with your feet. If you don't like the bundle of services you are getting from your local government in relation to the taxes you are paying, then move to one whose bundle you prefer. In equilibrium, everyone lives where they want to. Obviously unrealistic. The Tibu hypothesis assumes that moving is costless, that information is costless and universal, and a key one, that everybody knows not only which tier of government provides each service, but how provision is underpinned by block grant or tailored grant. Totally unrealistic. These assumptions are all false. There are also grounds for fearing that there might be no stable Tibu equilibrium, as rich people tend to move to lower and lower tax jurisdictions, while poor people are moved to higher and higher spending jurisdictions. Empirical studies have shown Tibu effects to be weak, for instance in UK location decisions. When the UK government embarked on one of its worst post-war policy disasters, the poll tax of 1989, one motive was Tibutian. The designers of the tax thought that if everyone had to pay a charge fixed by the local council for local services, there would be both efficiency effects, authorities would compete to be the most efficient, and sorting effects. Those who wanted subsidised opera could move to places that provided it, the rest need not. The experiment was also driven by another sensible idea, which I will discuss shortly, namely the marginal tax principle. The implementation, however, was terrible. The government ignored everybody who knew anything about local taxation, seeing them as part of the problem. The poll tax led not to the vindication of Charles Tibu, but to the fall of Margaret Thatcher. Nevertheless, as pure reasoning, there is nothing wrong with the Tibu model. The critical question for fiscal federalism is a behavioural one. Are citizens prepared to put up with wide variation in the quality, cost, and availability of local services within a single country? The boring but surely correct answer is, in some places yes, in other places no. To a first approximation, in any country where the phrase postcode lottery is often heard, as it is in the UK, Tibu sorting is not going to happen. A postcode lottery is a boo word. It means the quality and availability of services varying between one district and another. The public, who are not bound by a logicality constraint, often want both local autonomy and no postcode lotteries. They want two incompatible things. Local autonomy means that different localities do different things and have different priorities for doing things. That the public want two incompatible things makes it difficult for politicians who are bound by a logicality constraint, some of them at least. But there are other countries whose citizens do seem to tolerate postcode lotteries. They tend to be the relatively decentralized federations, such as Switzerland or the USA. The whole point of decentralized federalism is to allow services and tax rates to vary by subnational jurisdiction. Everyone knows in the USA that services are worse in West Virginia and Mississippi than they are in California and Massachusetts, even though, maybe because, the former are two of the poorest states in the Union and the latter are two of the richest. Many other countries are intermediate. In Canada, for instance, there seems to be general commitment, except perhaps in Quebec, perhaps in Alberta, to principles of a social union. In Canadian jargon, this was called CHST, for Canada Health and Social Transfer. It's now been split into two. But there is no assumption among Canadian policymakers that it is the job of the federal government to transfer resources from rich provinces to poor ones to the degree that each province can offer the same level of services, still less the same level of public sector wages. A crucial determinant here, therefore, may turn out to be whether public sector wage bargaining is done on a national scale, as in the UK, or a subnational scale, as in Canada. I use these observations to structure the rest of this lecture. I'm going to look at 5 possible ways of reducing VFI and consequently moral hazard. And I'm starting with the obvious one. Since we're in Scotland, let me start with independence. I will also reflect on Czechoslovakia, Quebec, and Spain. All 4 of these cases combine claims about the economy with claims about culture. The Czech Republic and Slovakia are culturally more distinct than their almost identical languages and common Habsburg heritage may suggest. The names of the months are exotic in Czech and plain in Slovak. What is now the Czech Republic, Bohemia, Moravia, was under Austrian rule, Slovakia under Hungarian rule up to 1918. So culturally more distinct than you might think. Quebec, obviously. Catalonia, obviously. Basque Country, obviously. Each with a different language to its host state, one with a unique language with no near neighbours. Some, but much less, Scottish nationalism is driven by a claim of cultural distinctiveness. Tibu sorting is easy with cultural symbols. Let those who want to call the months by fancy names live in the Czech Republic, and those who don't live in Slovakia. Let those who prefer Burns to Shakespeare, of whom I think I'm one, relocate to Scotland. Independence can also reduce VFI directly. I already pointed out that the Czech Republic and Slovakia both have low VFI. The Velvet Divorce of 1992-3 automatically ended transfers from one to the other. Likewise, Scottish independence would, in and of itself, reduce VFI in the rest of the UK, and also, I think, in Scotland. The famous, to some, and notorious, to others, Barnett transfers would end, and so all the tax generated in and off Scotland would stay in Scotland. Those of you who have read today's Daily Telegraph may see some polemical remarks attributed to me, which I'm not talking about today, but will in the reception if people want to probe me on them. But financially, what happens, fiscally, what happens if Scotland becomes independent is that Scotland ceases to receive the block grant and the automatic transfers that it gets from the UK, and it swaps that for the oil revenue. VFI is reduced. Does Scotland get richer or poorer as a consequence of making that swap? Well, some years it would get richer, some years it would get poorer. In the most recent year, for which we have Scottish Government data, it gets poorer. That is not the point of tonight's talk. My second solution to VFI is applying the marginal principle. By the marginal principle, I mean the principle that the Parliament responsible for levying the last pound, dollar, euro in tax is also responsible for deciding whether or not to spend the last pound, dollar, euro of public expenditure. Independence is sufficient, but not necessary to achieve this. The Scotland Act 2012, which will come into force if the vote is no on the 18th September, adopts a cunning plan, and it's essentially a Canadian plan. The UK government will, what the Canadians call, vacate 10 tax points of income tax in the pound. So where the standard rate of income tax in UK is 20 pence in the pound, the rate in Scotland, if Scotland votes no, is 10 pence, and it is then up to the Scottish Parliament to set a rate. The Scottish Parliament must set a rate. It is therefore forced under the cunning plan of the Scotland Act 2012 to face up to the real costs and benefits of public spending, because it has to set off its last pound in tax received against its last pound in expenditure. That is a prescription for fiscal responsibility which the UK's devolved parliaments have never had. Scottish Parliament taxes hardly at all, it spends a great deal. That's structural. It's nothing to do with, I'm not casting aspersions on the present Scottish Government or on its predecessors. I'm just saying that is how the Scottish Parliament was set up. Possibility 3 is don't equalise, let Tibu do the work. As I've said, this only works in jurisdictions where political culture so permits. Fiscal imbalance is low in Switzerland because people really do seem to believe in autonomy for its cantons and communes. If, however, you ask me how to change a political culture to make a country more like Switzerland, I'm afraid I have no answer. So I'm going on rather quickly to number 4, in a technical, rather boring jargon, equalising for resources but not for needs. This is once again what happens in Canada. Canadian regime for fiscal transfers works on equalisation for resources but not for needs. What do I mean by that? Transfers from the federal treasury to the provinces take account of their relative tax capacity, but not of the relative poverty of claimants on public expenditure. There are also provisions to exclude the outlier provinces from the working of these arrangements, which are too complicated for an evening when you're all waiting for your drinks. More important, I think, is the underlying political culture, which seems to be supportive of transfers for health and social services, but not of more general transfers from rich to poor provinces. Fifthly and finally, you can try to equalise for both needs and resources. If you want to see muscular egalitarianism in practice, visit the Commonwealth of Australia. I've published work on the Commonwealth Grants Commission elsewhere. Here I can summarise only the most salient points. The regime was set up in the 1930s, when the Great Depression and perhaps a prevailing Australian political ideology of mateship, with its egalitarian overtones, produced enough political consensus to create a Commonwealth level, top-level agency at arm's length from politicians. The Australian regime equalises for both resources and needs. It works by assessing the tax capacity of each state and what it would cost for an averagely efficient state government to deliver the same level of services to a similarly situated citizen anywhere in the Commonwealth. Note how carefully this mission statement, which is my paraphrase, I'm not quoting it literally, is phrased. The regime does not observe how the actual state governments fare, nor does it attempt to equalize between, for instance, urban and rural citizens, given that the costs of delivering public services will always be higher in rural areas. An egalitarian transfer regime sets up another type of moral hazard. Governments have an incentive to present their populations as poor, and a corresponding incentive not to make too strenuous a tax effort. If they are poor, they can just wait for the transfers to roll in. If they are rich, they may not see why they should bother with tax effort only to see it equalized away from them. I believe the Australian regime ingeniously avoids these traps, whereas the UK regimes totally fail to avoid them. One device is to lag their indices of state tax revenue and vital statistics. This has the effect that if the state makes an extra tax effort, it is not immediately equalized away. Another device is not, and this is really important, not to use any state government data as inputs to the quasi-regression model that determines the level of grant. That eliminates the most destructive zero-sum behavior observed in other jurisdictions. Perhaps much of the success of the regime depends just on the technocratic nature of its formulae, which are too deep for Australian politicians to understand. I'm going to end, as I began, on a parochial note. Policymakers in the UK, whether or not, whatever the vote on in 2 weeks' time, could learn lessons from, among others, Switzerland, Canada, and Australia. The regime of intergovernmental transfers in the UK is broken. The formula used to transfer tax receipts from UK centre to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland is full of perverse incentives, does not deliver what it was intended to because of past political interference, and if allowed to operate as it was designed to, would arrive at an undesirable outcome, namely equal expenditure per head across 4 countries with quite different GDP per head. Those of you who are soaked in British culture may remember a Monty Python sketch called The Summarised Proust Show. I have just tried to summarise the Barnett formula in 2 sentences and certainly failed. If anybody really wants to know about the Barnett formula, they'll have to buy me a pint later this evening. The regime for transferring resources to local spending authorities within England relies on contested, as I've said, contested and capturable concepts of need. At least in relation to local authorities, they should be replaced by a simple and more transparent regime using fewer but more robust measures of need. And a commission working in Wales has shown a way to do this, and it's done, I think, very well. The measures should include such things as the age structure and morbidity of the local population, which cannot in the short term be manipulated by the local authority. There should be a comprehensive reform of local government taxation, which, as I said earlier, could offer a rare combination of greater efficiency and greater fairness at the same time. It only needs a politician with the courage to institute a land value tax. There are 2 events that might, just might, hasten reform. Luckily, they are mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. They are a yes vote in Scotland on the 18th of September and a no vote in Scotland on the 18th of September. A yes would make the Scottish Parliament totally fiscally responsible and, as in the split of Czechoslovakia, would reduce VFI in both the successor states. It would force the rest of the UK to revisit its formulae for fiscal transfers. And it might give the Scottish Parliament, which will be heavily, I stress heavily, fiscally squeezed, the incentives required to create an efficient and fair regime. I've written for property tax, but for tax generally. A no would lead in the short run to the implementation of the Scotland Act 2012, with its embedded cunning plan. Principal Muscatelli is no longer here, but he and I were among the Sherpas working on the scheme which is embodied in the 2012 Act, so we do have some, or I do at least have some personal stake in it. The cunning plan that I mentioned was due to a working group which Professor Muscatelli chaired and of which I was a member. So Scotland Act 2012 is a definite advance, I think. But all the parties on the no side of current debate have promised to go further. If and when they do, they will have to think more seriously about both the marginal principle and the Tibu principle. That can only be a good thing, and on that note, I'd like to leave it. Thank you very much.